Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I want to acknowledge another VIP in the audience, someone I just met a few minutes ago, Margot Lazari, whose daughter, Elizabeth, is a first-classman at West Point. That means she's in the class of 2009, will graduate late May of next year, and she's a regimental commander. I want to tell you, that's going some. So congratulations to her, and thank you for being here. I showed Margot the picture on the front of this book. I didn't choose that picture. People at West Point did. So then I said to them later, I know I'm going to be asked about this picture. Who are these people? So this is a regimental staff, just the same kind of staff that Elizabeth is heading, and it's from last year, the class of 2008, and you can't see it very well because of the full dress hats they're wearing and the visors coming down and so on, but this regimental commander is also a woman, so we're very proud of Margot and glad that you're here this morning. I love to come to the Nixon Library. Every time I'm here, some nice person shows me a new exhibit that's underway, and they think they have a lot of energy here, and a lot of new things are being put up every time I come. This morning I feel that I'm back with old friends, and what I have for you basically is a report on how an innocent writer got mousetrapped. John mentioned that I'm at work on a Westmoreland biography. I've been at work on a Westmoreland biography, but West Point asked me to undertake this project. I have a great friend whose name is Ted Stroop. He's the chairman of the West Point Association of Graduates. And West Point wanted this book done primarily for honor education of cadets. And so Ted said, Bob, you need to go up to West Point and talk to them. You need to do it for the good of the team. Well, I went up and talked to them, and I said that if I did this book, it would have to be intellectually respectable. It would have to deal with the problems as well as the good things. And they said that that was the kind of book that they wanted too, and so I agreed to do it. And that caused me to put aside the Westmoreland biography that I had already been at work on for quite some time. But I'm glad that I did, because I thought that I knew a lot about West Point. After all, as John mentioned, I'm a third-generation graduate. My father and my grandfather are graduates. I had gone there as a cadet to study. I'd gone back and taught in the Department of English. I was even born there. And I found in the course of research for this book that there was a lot I didn't know about West Point, and much of it was very interesting to me, and so I'm glad that I got a chance to do that. I want to get this light on if I can. John, how do you get does anybody know how to turn on the light? I see. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Let's see. I can run an extension cord out and about if you like.
Well, I don't know if we need to go to that level. Well, see what you can do. Oh, perfect, wonderful. Thanks. Thank you very much. Since our time together is limited this morning, it seems to me that the way to get into this is to discuss some aspects of the book and the research for it in chunks. I'll call them chunks. We'll do a few chunks, and then I have one or two sidebars that I'll work in if time permits. But the thing to start with, I think, for any audience really, is to talk about the honor code and the honor system. And each has changed some over the years. I knew that the honor system had changed some over the years, but I was surprised to find that the honor code has. The code as it is now stated says a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. Later on in the discussion, I'll refer to the non-toleration clause. And that's the last part of that, or tolerate those who do. A cadet will not tolerate those who do. That's called the non-toleration clause. It's important to distinguish between the honor code, which is what I just stated, in its, as one honor committee chairman said, in its beautiful simplicity, and the honor system. The honor system is a somewhat complex, volatile, sometimes controversial set of policies and procedures used for implementing, protecting, and perpetuating the honor code. There is a cadet honor committee which is responsible for two things, really. One, for educating cadets on the imperatives of the code, and second, for operating elements of the honor system. The honor code, as you have seen, proscribes, that means prohibits, certain dishonorable behaviors. These have changed over the years. In the early days, the extent of the then unwritten code was the inviolability of a cadet's word and signature. That he in those early days was to be trustworthy. That's the key, to be trustworthy. You could trust his word, you could trust his signature. And that does not mean that some of the other elements of the code that are now form part of it, that you heard, stealing and cheating, were accepted or tolerated. They weren't, but they weren't part of the honor code, and the way that they were dealt with was primarily through the use of the military justice system, which means the use of courts martial in the early days. I should explain what the early days are. West Point was founded in 1802. So it's now in its what would this be, 206th year, let us say. And in the very early days, you would not recognize it at all. The first class graduated 2. So I mentioned the second fellow in that class in the book, and I say he graduated last in his class, but also second. So, so he had a reasonable chance. A lot of time passed before anything relating to the honor code was reduced to writing. And so this is an important aspect, I think, where the honor code and the observance of it and the, what will you call them, the modalities by which the code was taught and passed on is from cadet to cadet to cadet and class to class to class, honor committee to honor committee, always word of mouth, but in 2 ways. By word of mouth and by example. I think those are the 2 important teaching methods that perpetuated the honor code. And it evolved over time, as I have said. There came a point in 1907, now this is 105 years after the start, when cheating was made a part of the honor code, and guess what? It was made that way because the superintendent at that time, a general named Hugh Scott, directed it. Now, a reason I'm underlining that is because always before and always after, accretions to the honor code and changes to the honor system came from the cadets themselves. But in this case, the superintendent decreed this. And I don't know why. I spent almost all of last year at West Point, mostly in the archives, which I found very interesting and entertaining. But I did not learn the motivations behind this. Cheating was clearly not tolerated before. As I said, the court-martial was used as a method of dealing with that. But General Scott may have had in mind protecting the honest cadets from the few who were not. That's a guess on my part. Cadets are taught the meaning of honor by precept. That means, explaining it to them, by example, and also by formal and informal instruction. The plebes, who are the newly admitted members of the Corps of Cadets, are issued a small handbook. It's known as Bugle Notes. This is my copy. I still have it. It's one of my great treasures. And it is intended to introduce cadets to those things that are most important to the military academy and to being a cadet. Our class of 1956 entered 4 years earlier in the summer of 1952, and in our issue of the Bugle Notes, there's a new one for each class as they come in. The superintendent, who was then a wonderful officer named General Frederick Irving, recited, he said in this book are recited the traditions held sacred by the members of the Long Gray Line, and thus he admonished, cherish and pass them on to those who will follow after you. That's the whole deal. Cherish them yourselves and pass them on so that those who come after you will also hold them in the same regard that you do. That's the process by which reverence for honor and commitment to its precepts have been perpetuated from one class to another now, as I said, over 2 centuries. The commandant of cadets for our entering class, another very interesting officer, was a colonel named John K. Waters, son-in-law of George Patton and later a four-star general himself. And he said to us in the Bugle Notes, "You should die 1,000 deaths before you lie, cheat, or steal. There is nothing at West Point in which cadets take greater pride than the honor system." He said, "It is part of the Corps and remains the individual and collective trust and responsibility of the Corps. Learn about it, absorb it, guard it, and live by it." And then the very first essay in our Bugle Notes was on honor, and it was introduced by these words from the alma mater: "Guide us, thy sons aright, teach us by day by night, to keep thine honor bright," hence the title, "for thee to fight." And so then the imperatives of living by the honor code were explained to us in this essay, including non-toleration. And I want to make this point because we knew then, and cadets have known for at least all of the 19th century, and probably before that, that living by the honor code included non-toleration. In our Bugle Notes, it said, "Every man is honor-bound to report any breach of honor which comes to his attention." Now, you'll see why I underline that a little bit later in the remarks I want to make to you. Early editions of the Bugle Notes, not ours, I'm sorry to say, but for a long time, included an essay called "The Army as a Career." And so this essay said whether the Army provides a satisfying career. And this clearly extends to the United States Marine Corps and other services as well, I think. Whether it's a satisfying career depends entirely on your viewpoint. If you measure success by things accomplished, by a niche well filled, by the gratification of duty well and faithfully done, if your joy in life finds fulfillment in playing the game for the game's own sake, of winning the love and respect of the men serving under you, if you do not count the work, the trouble, the cost to yourself, and do not stop to think of where the credit will go, but only of the success of the team, then in the Army you will find contentment. I wish I had written that. That describes a profession in which commitment to service, competence, and character are the immutable hallmarks. And that's, of course, what we're trying to teach cadets to carry forth into the Army. Chunk 2, I would like to say a little bit about sources, because if you're going to write something that goes back to 1802, you know before you start that the sources are going to be, let's say, uneven. That would be the kindest thing you could say about them. The principal sources for this book were, as you might imagine, in the archives of the United States Military Academy. They're housed on the fourth floor front of what was then the current library. That was a venue that provided a vantage point for observing construction of the new library right across the street, and also a virtually nonstop symphony of air compressors, cable drums, numerous other instruments of construction music, including an especially diligent section of jackhammer players. An added feature was that the archives apparently have only two thermostat settings, frigid and boiling. In that respect, they reminded me of General Eisenhower's great comment about General Patton. He said, Patton's emotional range is very great, and he lived his life at one extreme or the other of it. And that's how the archives were maintained environmentally. I had arranged to begin research on the 5th of February, which coincidentally was my father's birthday. So before I reported the archives, I made my way to the West Point Cemetery, where I put 24 roses, red for me, cream for my sister, on my dad's grave. It was then 7:30 in the morning, 5 degrees above Fahrenheit, and according to the Newberg weather report, -15 with the wind chill factor considered. But by the time I got to the archives at 8 o'clock, I was pleased to discover that the wind velocity there was noticeably less. Over the next 7 months, I made repeated visits to West Point, always spending the bulk of my time in the archives. My research strategy was to proceed chronologically, working as much as possible with primary source materials. In this, of course, I was critically dependent on the archivist, since there was no comprehensive finding aid to honor-related materials. But among the rich sources presented for my review were what were called superintendent's letter books, large ledger-type volumes like this, handwritten, nicely collected in 11 volumes from the very early days. Wonderfully rich material. And then the West Point Thayer papers. Colonel Thayer was the most important superintendent the Military Academy has ever had. Served from 1817, that's 15 years after the founding of the Military Academy, until 1833, the longest tenure of any superintendent. And the Thayer papers were wonderfully collected and published by the Association of Graduates a number of years after his tenure. And then later the Association of Graduates nominated Colonel Thayer for the Hall of Fame of Great Americans as an educator, of course, and they had collected a lot of great material to underpin that nomination, which was successful. And then, of course, there were extensive files dealing with the several major crises that had confronted the honor code and system at West Point, and much more. This is what always tantalizes scholars and researchers. There had been a major fire in 1838, which apparently gobbled up some of the records, but we don't know how many or what, because it all went with the fire. So who knows what that would have been? But then sometimes that's a great loss. Sometimes there are unexpected gains as well. They were renovating quarters 100 at West Point, which is where the superintendent resides. And under the floorboards, they found a packet of letters that had belonged to Colonel Thayer. So then this is many years after his tenure. So you never know. Who knows what's out there that will turn up another time. I had to cease work on the research at the end of August because I was running out of time. If anybody who knows me knows that I'm much more of a dinosaur or a turtle, a tortoise instead of a hare when it comes to research and writing. I'm maybe average one book every 4 or 5 years, and in this case they gave me a little over a year from a standing start. So at the end of August I packed up what I had and brought it home and tried to give it some shape and some narrative drive. In the early part of this project I was afraid I wouldn't have enough to work with, and in the end I was drowning in a lot of material, and I had to try to pick and choose amongst those materials. I'd like to say a little bit about the origins. This will be another chunk that I'll try to make brief because we don't want to be here too long. But I mentioned that in the early days, West Point's first class included only 2 cadets, and in the first decade, they could produce only 71 cadets. My grandfather graduated in 1891, so that's almost a century later. In his class, 66 cadets. He was last or next to last, but he had a great career as an infantry colonel, so I guess you can say it worked out all right. I had a wonderful friend at West Point, a chaplain named Dick Camp, a longtime chaplain of the cadet chapel there. At the time of the bicentennial, that was in 2002, he was invited back to preach a sermon, special bicentennial sermon in the cadet chapel. And he took as his theme, everything is different, but nothing has changed. And by that he meant lots of things, externals, visible things had changed. The size of the Corps had changed. Women had been admitted to the Corps. The campus at West Point had many, many changes there. The curriculum had changed in many ways. All those things had changed, but nothing was different, meaning that the values that West Point established for itself in the early days had been perpetuated. I believe that, and my research revealed nothing to contradict that, so I thought that was a wonderful formulation on his part. Identifying the origins of the honor code and of the honor system proved to be a more difficult task because, as I've said a couple of times already, for a long, long time nothing was written down, and so the way in which it was perpetuated was class to class and even cadet to cadet, as I have told you. Each cadet company elects an honor representative to serve as a member of the honor committee, and then the honor committee elects a chairman. And now these days, because the Corps is large, there's some deputy chairmen with different responsibilities like education and that type of thing. I remember the time when my own cadet company elected my class's honor representative as one of the most serious sessions that we ever had together. And that was a great honor, and we chose a great classmate for that, and that worked out very well. I want to mention a few surprises. I told you at the outset that I thought I knew a lot about this when I started. I'm now humbled by finding out I didn't know nearly as much as I might have thought I did. West Point was established, as I said, in 1802. The Honor Code, that's just a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. That simple formulation was not written down until 1932, 130 years after the founding of the Academy. And even then, it was not written down in the way I just said it, that neat, concise formulation. Instead, it was a sort of an essay on the thing. I was absolutely certain that the honor code we learned in the summer of 1952 included that non-toleration clause, will not tolerate those who do. Not true. That was not added to the formal written code until 1970. I could hardly believe that. I was certain that we knew that. We did know it. It was in the bugle notes in a different way, but it was not written in that neat little formulation. So those were things quite surprising to me. The first person to write this down, to write down the honor code, was a cadet named Lawrence Lincoln, class of 1933. I later knew him. He became a lieutenant general in the Army and highly respected, and was the younger brother of George Lincoln, one of the longtime serving department chairman at West Point, ran the social sciences department for years and years, a highly regarded thing. While he was a cadet in the summer of 1932, Lawrence Lincoln produced this first written articulation. He typed it up during summer encampment by lantern light, late at night in his tent on Clinton Field. If you've been to West Point, Clinton Field is out in front of the library and the cadet barracks, just adjacent to the plain on which the cadets parade. And in the old days, they used to move there in tents for summer encampment. So he's out there late at night in his tent with a lantern and I presume an aged typewriter, and he's typing this up, and I have seen it. In fact, I have a picture of one of the pages in the book. It's still, those pages are still in the archives. It's a sort of a rough yellow paper, and a big font. I don't know where he got a typewriter with a big font like that, and it's got a lot of typos and things like that. But that's it. That's the very first time anybody ever wrote this down. And General Lincoln, Cadet Lincoln, is a modest man. He later said that this document was not his product, and not even the product of the honor code of his day. He said it was the product of 100 years of the Corps developing the honor system and passing it on, in part by the honor book, which I'll say something about in a minute, but mainly by word of mouth and practice. And even then, what they produced was not the succinct one-sentence statement of the honor code as we know it today, but it was rather, I'll call it an interim description of the code and details of a system in which it was embedded. There was not a formal honor committee until rather late also. In the early days, violators were dealt with, let me rephrase that, suspected violators were dealt with in a very harsh, peremptory, and ad hoc manner. If a cadet, for example, was believed by his classmates or by others to be guilty of lying, there would be an ad hoc committee formed, usually of first-classmen, that's the seniors, and they would bring this poor fellow up and interrogate him in some way, and if they decided that he was guilty, which they almost always did, they would either drive him off, and I mean that literally and physically, drive him off, or on at least one occasion that I found in the archives, tar him and feather him. And then, I don't know how he made his way from that in that condition, but obviously he did. These were actions taken in the heat of the moment. As far as I can tell, the person who was accused had virtually no equities, certainly no representation, no, what do we call it, no presumption of innocence, and so on. And And then over time, it became a little more formalized. They had what they call Vigilance Committees, and the Vigilance Committees had the advantage, I will say, of being formed before the fact, so that, it's not in the heat of the moment, and the people involved have been chosen by their classmates, presumably in somewhat the same way we chose honor committee members, because they had some respect for them as maybe being among the better, more mature cadets. And these vigilance committees operated in somewhat the same fashion as the ad hoc committees, but with the at least tacit agreement of the administration, the officers who ran the military academy for a long period of time. But not always, but usually with the tacit agreement of the administration. Then there came a point after World War II. World War II was traumatic for everybody, I'm sure, but it was really traumatic at West Point because they had a policy established in Washington of trying to get as many young officers out to the Army as they could, and so they began graduating classes early, and they graduated so many classes early that they wound up with only one class left, and they were plebes, new cadets, and they'd only been there 4 months. And then 2 months later, when those plebes had 6 months service, they brought in another plebe class, in one source said without examination, so that's a little scary. And now you've got two classes there, neither one of which is capable of passing on to the succeeding class. The things that I've emphasized several times already are passed on in that manner. So immediately after the war, the superintendent was a name that you will all know, Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur convenes a committee and puts officers and I think maybe he chose some of the cadets he thought were more up to this than others from the class of 1920, and they basically formulate the approach that they're going to now begin to teach again to the succeeding classes. Here are your responsibilities. Here's what the honor code is all about. Here's a way in which we're going to administer that. And so MacArthur decided that the vigilance committees would now be formalized as honor committees, and in the autumn of 1922, the first honor committee, so designated and has its picture in the Howitzer, the cadet yearbook, takes office. MacArthur left that summer, so you can't really say that he was there when that happened, but he laid the groundwork for it, and that was a major step forward in terms of how things were administered at West Point. I was told to not talk very long here, but I do have to talk about two more things, and I'll do it briefly, but we can come back to it in the discussion period. I have to tell you about the two major crises at West Point that involved widespread violations of the honor code and how they were dealt with. The first one, I think many people here will know about at least one of these, and probably maybe both. But the first one involved the football team primarily, and took place in 1951. When it was discovered that there was an organized cheating ring that was getting examination questions in advance and passing them on to members of the football team who had not yet taken the examinations, so that they could then have this improper knowledge to assist them in doing better on the examinations. It's important to emphasize that this was discovered, revealed by a cadet. They say every time there's been a problem, the source of dealing with the problem has been the cadets themselves, with important help from officers, but the key factor is cadets themselves have prized their system and have taken the steps necessary to perpetuate it, or in some cases, like now, to regenerate it. Eventually, about 90 cadets who were involved were dismissed from the military academy. They were mostly football players. Everyone who was not a football player was someone who was associated with a football player, either a roommate or an academic coach or in some other way. The Army Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Army went to see the President to tell him that they planned to dismiss these cadets. And the President, having heard the situation, it was then President Truman, made one comment: can't do anything else. And so they went back and they did that. One of the things that was very good about a very bad situation was that it was very apparent that the Corps of Cadets in general, which was about 2,500 cadets in those days, so now 90 have been separated. That gives you an idea of the magnitude of it. The rest of the Corps of Cadets had no sympathy whatsoever for the tutors and were fully supportive of their being dismissed. And one cadet even went around and surveyed his classmates and wrote an article about this for Assembly, the West Point Alumni Magazine, to reassure the graduates that the cadets who were not involved in this were fully supportive of the dismissal of those who were. And another officer wrote a piece for, I guess it was United Press at that time. I don't think it had become UPI, and said the same thing. And he was an interesting fellow. Was an English department instructor named John Eisenhower, the son of the later president. The second episode took place in 1976, and it was in some ways to me more troubling because it did not have a locus like the football team and those associated with it. It had to do with a class, and one class, like they were the juniors class, and they were asked to do a take-home examination that was a computer-type problem, and they were supposed to do that without any outside assistance or collaboration with others. And when they turned these things in, one cadet wrote on it words to the effect, "This is not entirely my own work." And so that caused the instructors to start taking a look at these papers, these solutions that had been turned in, and they found a number of more than coincidental likenesses between certain papers, and that led them to identify a number of people who seemed to have derived their solutions from looking at solutions of others. I shouldn't tell you this is very sad, but one had even put a doodle in the margin that another cadet from whom he copied had apparently put in the margin. Well, this turned out to be an extremely traumatic thing for West Point. And it led to major changes that I'll describe to you, and then I'll try to wrap up after this because I know we're running short of time here. The upshot of this was that several commissions and study boards were established. One of them you will probably have heard of, the Boorman Commission, was run by Frank Boorman, who was a graduate of West Point and an astronaut and later the president of Eastern Airlines. And the Boorman Commission in particular, they said this more than others, said that there were some institutional failures here that contributed to the, they did not exonerate the cadets, but they said there's some institutional failures here as well. And so they thought that it shouldn't be entirely the cadets who suffered as a result of this, and they suggested certain changes. Well, certain changes were made, and they were very significant ones, and they are a totally new departure. This is now in the spring of 1976 that all this is happening. Total departures from what had happened in the past. Always in the past, there had been, as a way of dealing with convicted honor violators, what was called the single sanction. This non-toleration clause, you say, can't tolerate those who violate the honor code, and so they were invariably dismissed, almost invariably. I found a few early cases, one involving a superintendent that you will have heard of, Robert E. Lee, in which a cadet was given a second chance. And if there were time, I would go into that in a little more detail. But so what happens in this case is it is decided that certain members, certain of those who were found guilty of violations, and there were around 150 cadets in this instance, would, if they met certain conditions, be offered an opportunity to apply for readmission. So they've been dismissed, but this time it's not forever, maybe. And so those who were dismissed were offered the opportunity to do certain things. They could join the Army, or they could go out in the Army as an enlisted man for a year, or they can enroll in another educational institution for a year, or they could take civil employment for a year. And then they had to get evaluations of them from the people that they were supervised by. The interesting thing is that those who went out into the Army got the strongest evaluations from the first sergeants of the units that they served in, which Army guys would consider important evidence. Of the 150, I think it was 156, around 100 applied for readmission, and there was a special readmissions committee set up, chaired by one of my former colleagues in the English department, who had become the chairman of that department by then. And so those who were readmitted came back a year later, joined the class behind the class that they had been in, and about 85 of them eventually graduated and were commissioned. Now, theoretically, no one knows who those were. I think if you wanted to devote the effort to combing the register of graduates, you might pretty well identify most of them. But that one person who headed the readmissions committee, and who is my close friend, told me that he does know the names because, you know, he was the chairman of the committee. He told me that he had evaluated the performance of the class as a whole and those who had been readmitted and graduated and served full careers. And his criterion he used was, did they reach full colonel? And he said 20.6% of the class not involving these people reached colonel, and 19.6% of them did. So you can say that, he says, and I have no quarrel with this, that given a second chance, those who were readmitted, which are not the whole, made good use of that opportunity. Well, I conclude this book, if you read it, you'll see this, on a, I'll say, a conditionally optimistic note in a passage I would like to read to you. It goes like this. As the military academy moves through the 21st century, the honor code remains as it has always been, a precious thing, fragile, entirely dependent on each new cohort of cadets to adopt it, make it their own, fiercely protect it, and march forward in its service. That this process shall continue in perpetuity is the heartfelt hope and dream of all those proud and grateful members of the Long Gray Line who have shared the privilege of living by its inspiring standards. End of book. I'll make one commercial observation before I wrap this up. All royalties from the sale of Honor Bright go not to me but to the West Point Association of Graduates. I note that Christmas is right around the corner. This is your chance to load up. Go for it. And with that, I'll cease work and invite your comments and questions. Thank you.
My friends, Dr. Sorley would be pleased to take your questions. I'll bring the microphone to you if you'd like to talk to him.
I have a question regarding your beginning of the lecture about tolerancy. What is your final word of the tolerance? Is it zero tolerancy or no tolerancy or just a little bit of tolerance?
There have to be two parts to the answer. The first part goes to cadet observance of the honor code, which says, just to reiterate again, a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. That's an absolute. Any cadet who observes what he or she believes may be or is an honor violation is obliged to report that. And where you report that is to your cadet honor representative. And then the honor representative begins a process that is now very well structured and has a lot of protection in it for the rights of the accused. In our litigious society that we now live in, the honor system has evolved in that way. There will then be an investigation by an appointed investigator or investigating subcommittee, and then one of several things can happen. They can determine that it really wasn't an honor violation, although it might have appeared to the reporting cadet, in which case no further action is taken. Or they can say that this should go to trial. And if it goes to trial, then the cadet may be convicted of an honor violation or may be acquitted of the honor violation, in which case no further action. If the cadet is convicted of an honor violation, then the matter goes to the authorities, to the superintendent of the military academy. The superintendent is like the president of a college or university. All right, so now we've established that in the operation of the honor code, there's only one course of action. If you observe what you believe to be an honor violation, you have to report it, and that process will play out. All right, now, but the second thing is that what they call this now the opportunity, the authority for the superintendent to take one of more than one possible course of action is superintendent's discretion. The superintendent is the president of the college. Now, the guilt has been established, all right? So now the superintendent has the authority to deal with it in one of several ways. One way is dismissal. And if it was considered, I mean, in the early days, the outlook was that all honor violations are the same. You know, if you've an honor violation, it's an honor violation. You commit an honor violation, you're gone. And under the situation now that now pertains, there is, I think, recognition that some honor violations are more serious than others, depending on intent primarily. So then the superintendent gets a recommendation from the honor code, and they may recommend that he use discretion, or they may recommend that he dismiss the cadet. And then he takes into account other things, such as, is this a relatively new cadet who has not had the opportunity to live under the honor code for very long and maybe hasn't internalized it as much as he might later on? Is this well, this would be unlikely, but is this more than the first time that this cadet has been convicted of this? That would be, you'd be finished then. But if the superintendent decides for those reasons or others that pertain to the individual cadet that he wants to exercise discretion, then he can do one of several things. He can admonish the cadet. He can put the cadet into a re-education program. This is probably what happens most often, in which case you get an officer mentor and you go through a fairly well-prescribed procedure. I think it's 5 or 6 months long. You're required to maintain a journal of your contemplation of what you have done and what you're doing to overcome that. And then this officer makes a recommendation as to whether you've rehabilitated yourself adequately or not, and all this. Or the superintendent could say, I'm turning this man back, man or woman now, back, which means you join the class behind the one that you were in. So there are a lot of different aspects to it, but the short answer, I felt I needed to give you a long answer because it is rather complicated, but it's not complicated in this respect. The short answer is any cadet who observes what he or she thinks to be a violation is obliged to report that, and then the honor committee has to deal with that. That's the first part. And secondly, if a cadet is found guilty of an honor violation, now the superintendent has discretion in how to deal with that. Good question, thanks.
Bob, comparing year to year, generation to generation, era to era, is there anything that can be discerned by changing rates of numbers of violations per class or per decade? Are there more or less about the same?
Yeah, that's also a good question, and there's a clear-cut answer to it, too. Two factors seem to be primary in influencing how well or less well the honor code is accepted and adhered to by the cadets of a given day. And those are turbulence, and turbulence especially in increases in the size of the Corps. Every time that's happened, there's been a period of assimilation of a larger cohort of people. You have fewer people to educate the larger number than you did in the past, and so that's had a big factor. And then there's just no question but that external factors play a part as well. So I talked about World War I and how it practically eliminated the Corps of Cadets and certainly any senior leadership of the Corps of Cadets. And MacArthur had to put the tactical officers in there to act like, you know, a surrogate upperclassman for a period of time. When the military academy began, as I pointed out, there were, you know, just a handful of cadets. But after Colonel Thayer got it stabilized and regularized, then there was a specified period that you studied, and there were a specified number of cadets and so on. In my day, in the mid-50s, there were 2,496 cadets. That was the authorized size of the Corps of Cadets. Most of them came there by congressional appointments. Their senators or their congressmen appointed them. There were certain other routes, but that was by far the main one. General Westmoreland, about whom I'm now studying preparatory to biography, is very proud of the fact that he got the size of the Corps of Cadets increased. It didn't happen until after he left, but he's the one that did all the arguing for it and laid the groundwork for it, up to 4,400 cadets. And they went from 2,500, say, to 4,400 pretty fast, and that caused pretty big problems in a lot of different ways, and this is realm is one of them. Now, how do you know about things like this? You can look at the statistics, and I have, and by the way, I think the statistics are pretty instructive in making it clear that year to year, including now, cadets are taking seriously their obligation to report honor violators, because you can see the reports and where they came from. By the way, quite a few of them are self-reported, and that's sort of a realm in which superintendent's discretion is probably a good idea. But the other thing, I said I'd mention this, and then I felt I was running out of time, but I'll take the question as a chance to say something about it. The honor book. The honor book is not a formal thing. It's one of these ledger kinds of deals, and the custodian of the honor book is the chairman of the honor committee in his class, and at the end of his tenure, he writes in the honor book some observations and sometimes some instructions for his successor. And the earliest entry is about 1928, as I recall, and usually it's 2 or 3 pages. It's handwritten, most cases, only 1 or 2 that are typed and pasted in there, and you can see in there a lot about the ups and downs of the seriousness with which given cohorts of cadets are taking their responsibilities especially for administration of the honor system, or at least you can see what the honor committee chairman thinks about that, which is probably pretty good, pretty accurate. A couple of them are somewhat disheartened. I mean, it's very interesting to see, and one of them, this was stunning to me. I told you about the 1951 honor scandal involving the football team. The honor committee chairman of that class, 1951, wrote nothing about that in his honor book entry. The next year, the class of 1952's honor chairman wrote a lot about it, and he was not happy, and felt that the 51 had let him down, and so that was quite interesting. There's only one copy of this. It's not published or anything. It says you have to go to the honor committee chairman and ask him to let you see it, and he let me see it. Thank you, sir.
Bob, I was going to ask you the basis for your guarded optimism, but you've already answered that very beautifully in your answers to previous questions. But I can't drive all the way over here without saying something.
I would like to add a little bit to that then, if you
I think this will give you an opportunity to.
Yeah.
Let me preface. Coincidentally, this morning, in a movie review in the LA Times, Ken Tran reviewing The Changeling, the last paragraph of that review, Tran says that the movie, which he liked very much, by the way, will remind us of the fragility and necessity of our hope in truth and decency. And when you were talking about your chaplain's comment about the way in which change is predictable, it's going to happen, but that standards are constant, I thought of that when you said that, because I thought of Turan making the point that these standards, even though our ability to adhere to them may change, our respect for them doesn't.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I'm glad you came here to make that. In this case, I would say a couple things maybe. First, that I hope this is apparent, but I need to reinforce it maybe. The purpose of the honor code and the honor system as a way of enforcing the honor code is not just for cadets at West Point. It's to inculcate in these future leaders of our Army a code of behavior and a code of conduct and a system of values that we want them to take out into the Army and infuse throughout the whole Army. Now clearly, the United States Army does not consist only of, in its West Pointers, of people who are honorable people. We ask for and expect and usually get from people of all ranks, privates and sergeants and lieutenants from any source and all the way through, standards of honorable behavior. But West Point is an old institution, and as an institution has a particular responsibility, we think, to carry these values forth. There are two things I want to say about how the basis for my optimism of now. I said conditional optimism, and that's got to be because, as I said in that closing peroration that I read to you, the honor system is a fragile thing, and it depends for its perpetuation on every class, and really in many ways every cadet, accepting it, valuing it, trying to emulate it, and try to pass it on and teach it to others. And if ever a class falls down on that, this could all come down. Two things about it. One, I have always believed that among those who seek to go to West Point, there's a high level of self-selection because they think they know what West Point is like, and they want to be like that, and that's why they want to go to West Point, and they want to be with people like that. Jenny and I know an exceptional young woman, a retired captain. She's retired because she was grievously wounded in Iraq, who was from California, by the way. Her name is Dawn Halfaker. You may have heard of her. Dawn was recruited to go to West Point to play basketball, which is something she did quite well. And frankly, as she told Jenny and me, she didn't know that much about West Point when she went there. And she said she'd been there a few months. And she looked around at the other cadets and her instructors and her tactical officers, and she said, I had found my tribe. That's the people she wanted to be with. And that was very meaningful to me and to Jenny. The other thing about it is these youngsters who are there now are coming to West Point at a time when they know that our country is at war, and it's not a short thing, and their expectation is and must be that when they leave there, they will lead American soldiers in combat. And I must say I find that very admirable. I know a few cadets. I met a number of others when I was in the course of this research, and I am very proud of them, and I hope that they will carry on the values of West Point as their forebears have, and I expect that they are going to do just that.